town hall doors burst open as Margaret cried, "You lied, James. You're no heir." Gasps rippled across the crowd, their faith crumbling in seconds. James, the supposed millionaire, stood frozen, his mask slipping under the harsh fluorescent lights. Margaret's voice shook as she clutched torn papers, her hands trembling with betrayal. The townsfolk shifted uneasily, whispers crackling like fire through the room. James' calm smirk faltered as truth burned the stage he built. Margaret shouted again, "You stole from us, all of us!" The crowd's silence deepened, heavy as stone, every eye fixed on the con artist. Fear and rage swirled together, a storm ready to break loose. Margaret's cry still echoed as silence pressed down like iron. She whispered, "You promised us a future." Her voice cracked with pain, more wound than anger. James adjusted his tie, forcing composure, his voice smooth yet hollow. He said, "I gave you hope, Margaret. Isn't that worth something?" The crowd bristled, fury boiling beneath their shock. A man shouted from the back, "You took our savings." The words split the room like thunder. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, the betrayal raw on her face. James' mask of confidence stretched thin, his charm unraveling thread by thread. The crowd's distrust thickened, crushing him. The hall's air grew heavier with every breath. Margaret turned to the crowd, her voice shaking. "He promised jobs, stability, a future we deserve." Her words struck like knives. James snapped, "You begged me to lead." His charm soured into venom. The skeptical man shouted, "You led us to ruin." Gasps flared again, the crowd erupting in half-shouts, half-silence. Margaret's hands dropped, her torn papers scattering across the floor. The fluttering sound echoed, sharp as gunfire. James' eyes darkened, panic crawling beneath his polished mask. The townsfolk surged closer, anger brewing into something uncontrollable. Margaret whispered, "I trusted you, James." Her voice cracked like broken glass. James clenched his jaw, silence drowning his reply. The crowd pressed tighter, their eyes burning with anger. A woman near the front cried out, "We believed you." Her sob cut through the tension. James finally growled, "Belief is a currency too." The words chilled the hall, echoing in silence. Margaret's shoulders sagged, grief weighing her down like stone. The crowd roared in protest, voices colliding in fury. The illusion was shattered, and James stood exposed, a predator stripped of disguise. The room shook with voices, outrage flooding like a tidal wave. James stepped back, his hands raised defensively, eyes darting for escape. Margaret straightened, grief hardening into fury. She shouted, "You will pay for every lie." The crowd echoed her cry, a chorus of betrayal. James' polished mask shattered completely, sweat dripping as his breathing quickened. The hall's walls seemed to close in, rage echoing off every surface. Margaret's trembling ended, her eyes blazing with fire. The con was no longer hidden, it lay bleeding under the glare of truth. Margaret sat at her small kitchen table, staring at overdue bills stacked like tombstones. She whispered, "How much longer can I hold on?" The room was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator. A picture of her late husband stared back from the wall, his smile a ghostly reminder of stability long gone. Her daughter's college acceptance letter sat unopened on the counter, another weight she couldn't carry. Margaret pressed her forehead into her hands, tears dampening the worn wood. Her desperation was a wound, raw and unhealed. She muttered, "Maybe James was right. Maybe he really can save us." The words felt like surrender, not hope. At the diner the next morning, Margaret forced a smile as she poured coffee for a table of farmers. Her hands trembled, but she kept moving. She said, "Sugar's free today, fellas, don't tell the boss." Laughter softened the moment, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion. Behind the counter her friend Sarah whispered, "You're running yourself dry, Margaret." Margaret replied softly, "I have to keep going for her." She meant her daughter, but the words cracked in her throat. The bell above the door chimed, and James walked in, polished and confident. Margaret's chest tightened. He looked like the answer to every prayer she'd whispered into the night. Margaret sat in her car outside the diner after her shift, gripping the steering wheel. Her knuckles whitened as she whispered, "I'm so tired of fighting alone." In the distance, James leaned against his black car, speaking smoothly to townsfolk. His laughter carried, warm and inviting, pulling her like a magnet. She watched him shake hands, promise futures, light hope where there was only dust. Margaret pressed her lips together, envy and longing mixing like poison. She muttered, "Why can't it be real?" Her reflection in the rearview mirror showed more than fatigue. It showed the hunger to believe in something, anything. That evening, Margaret tucked her daughter Emily into bed. Emily asked softly, "Mom, are we going to be okay?" Margaret forced a smile, brushing back her daughter's hair. She said, "Of course, sweetheart, always." But the words tasted bitter. Emily, full of hope, whispered, "James says he's going to bring jobs here. Maybe you won't have to work so hard." Margaret froze, her heart twisting. She kissed her daughter's forehead and whispered, "Sleep now." In the dark, Margaret's face crumbled, the weight of her lies pressing deeper than the burden of bills. She sat on the edge of the bed, silent, tears falling. Alone in her living room, Margaret stared at James' flyer promising a future for all. The bold letters mocked her desperation. She whispered, "This is madness," but her hands didn't let go. The firelight from the old stove flickered across her face, highlighting fear and yearning. She remembered her late husband's steady voice, "Don't trust easy promises." She clenched the flyer tighter, knuckles white, fighting between memory and need. Finally, she whispered, "I can't lose everything, not again." It was the moment the con artist had won. She didn't know it yet, but her soul had already signed the deal. James stood tall on the wooden stage in the town square, his voice carrying with polished ease. He declared, "Together we'll rebuild this town into the jewel it was always meant to be." His words poured like honey, filling cracks of despair that had grown deep. The crowd leaned forward, hungry for every promise, their cheers rising like a tide. Margaret stood in the front row, her chest tight, tears stinging her eyes as she whispered, "Maybe this really is our chance." James' smile widened, flawless and rehearsed. Yet sharp eyes flicked across faces, calculating, weighing, studying reactions like currency. Behind him, a banner read, "The heir returns," bold against the setting sun. The air pulsed with belief, the crowd clapping as if salvation had already arrived. Margaret clutched her coat, her hands trembling, caught between fear and overwhelming hope. Later that night, the diner hummed softly, neon lights buzzing against the windows. James leaned against the counter with effortless charm, his polished shoes gleaming against the worn floor. He said smoothly, "You deserve more than scraping by, Margaret. I can help you get there." Margaret lowered her gaze, cheeks warming, whispering, "It sounds too good to be true." James chuckled softly, his voice low and intimate. "Sometimes life offers a second chance, if you're brave enough to take it." His hand brushed against hers across the counter, the brief touch sparking electricity that startled her. Margaret's heart raced, hope blooming where exhaustion had lived for years. From the kitchen doorway, Sarah watched, arms crossed, jaw tight, her sharp eyes cutting through the glamour. She muttered under her breath, "He's selling smoke and she's buying every breath of it." The hotel's dining hall glowed with chandelier light, a rare luxury in the small town. James raised a glass, his tone silky, to brighter tomorrows, and the courage to believe again. Applause rang out, silverware clinking against china. Margaret sat beside him, hands clasped in her lap, heart fluttering as if she had been invited into a world she never thought she'd touch. The leaders of the town leaned close, their laughter echoing through the gilded room as doubt drowned beneath fine wine. James leaned toward Margaret, whispering in her ear, "You'll have a place in this future, I promise." Her face flushed, hope overwhelming her better judgment. Across the table, Robert leaned toward another guest, muttering low, "He's too smooth. Nothing's this perfect." His words sliced quietly, nearly drowned by the music, but the unease hung heavy in the air for anyone who cared to hear. Morning sunlight bathed the main street as James strode confidently, shaking hands, slipping envelopes discreetly into calloused palm. He said warmly, "An investment in your faith, a seed for tomorrow." Shopkeepers and farmers smiled, clutching the envelopes, their eyes bright with new hope. Margaret watched from across the street, whispering to Sarah, "He's really changing everything." Sarah's reply was sharp, her voice laced with suspicion. "Or he's buying loyalty, Margaret. Can't you see it?" Margaret frowned, her tone defensive. "You just don't understand him." James looked across the crowd, his smile lingering for a moment longer than necessary. For an instant, the warmth drained from his expression, revealing a predator's calculation before softening again. Margaret missed it. Sarah did not. Her stomach sank as she muttered, "He's playing us all, and you're the prize." That night, the storm outside rattled Margaret's windows, thunder rolling like a warning. She lay in bed, eyes wide, staring at the ceiling, whispering, "He's too perfect. Nothing in life comes this easy." Beside her, Emily stirred, whispering in her sleep, "James says he'll fix everything." Margaret turned, staring at her daughter's peaceful face, her heart splitting between maternal fear and desperate hope. She clutched the blanket tighter, her body trembling with doubt. The shadows from the lightning crawled across her walls like fingers pointing at her guilt. "Please, let it be true," she whispered into the storm, her words carried into the darkness. Across town, in a warmly lit study, James leaned over a ledger, his smile cruel and private, as he tallied the next steps of his game. The town meeting was supposed to be routine, but whispers spread like wildfire before James even spoke. A young clerk entered with a stack of documents, his voice shaking as he said, "These records don't match your claims." Papers spilled onto the table, revealing a trail of false signatures and missing funds. Gasps rippled across the room, the once loyal crowd frozen in disbelief. Margaret clutched her chest, her breath shallow, whispering, "No, it can't be." James' face hardened for a flicker before his smile returned, sharp and cold. He said smoothly, "These are fabrications, an attempt to smear me." But the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Robert's voice rang out, firm, "You've been lying to us from the start." The air cracked with tension, the first layer of illusion peeling away. Behind the diner that night, Sarah confronted Margaret, gripping her arm tightly. She hissed, "Wake up, he's been bleeding this town dry." Margaret's eyes brimmed with tears as she stammered, "But he promised us a future." Sarah's voice broke, "He promised me too." Margaret blinked, stunned, realizing Sarah had once believed in him as well. The betrayal was deeper than she imagined. Sarah whispered, "I warned you because I saw myself in you, and I won't watch him destroy another soul." Margaret pulled back, torn between her trust in James and the raw truth in Sarah's eyes. Thunder rolled in the distance, the night heavy with dread. The next day, Margaret walked into the bank, clutching her savings book. She froze when she saw the silent enabler banker Thomas, avoiding her gaze. She asked quietly, "Where's my money?" His hands shook as he stammered, "It's tied in investments." Margaret's voice rose, trembling, "Investments with James?" Silence answered her. Thomas finally whispered, "I didn't want to lose my position. He offered more than I could refuse." Margaret staggered back, betrayed not just by James, but by the very system she trusted. Her voice cracked, "You knew, and you said nothing." Thomas lowered his eyes, shame burning across his face, but his silence was louder than words. That evening, Margaret entered James' office, determination overriding her fear. She found him with another figure, her supposed friend Linda, seated too closely, laughter laced with conspiratorial ease. Margaret's voice broke. "Linda, you too?" Linda's smile faded as she rose, revealing herself as James' silent accomplice. James leaned back in his chair, eyes cold as steel, and said, "Some betrayals cut deeper when they come from those closest." Margaret's knees buckled, the world tilting beneath her feet. Linda whispered, "I only did what I had to." Margaret's voice cracked. You sold me out. Silence followed, heavy and merciless, sealing the cruel twist of trust. The revelation burned Margaret's soul raw. She stumbled into the night, the cold air biting her skin. Every promise replayed in her mind, every lie reshaping itself into truth. Her trust had been the currency, her hope the weapon used against her. James's words, Linda's betrayal, Thomas's silence, they collided like shards in her chest. She whispered into the darkness, he was never ours, he was never real. The storm above broke, rain soaking her, as if the heavens themselves mourned her naivety. Yet deep beneath the grief, something hardened, a spark of fury waiting to ignite. The game had changed, and Margaret was no longer blind. The town square was packed, the storm's aftermath still wet on the cobblestones. Margaret stepped forward, her voice carrying above the restless crowd. She shouted, James, no more lies. We know who you are. James stood tall on the stage, his suit damp, his eyes burning with defiance. He snapped, You're nothing without me. I gave this place hope. Gasps spread through the crowd, betrayal finally heavier than belief. Robert's voice boomed, You gave us chains disguised as promises. The tension was unbearable, the entire town vibrating with rage. Margaret's hand trembled as she pointed at him, declaring, You used us all. The illusion shattered into open war. James spread his arms wide, shouting, I built your faith. Without me you're nothing but dust and broken dreams. His words echoed with venom, no longer sweet but sharp as blades. Margaret's eyes filled with fire, her voice cracking, Faith is not yours to sell. The crowd roared in agreement, voices rising like thunder. Emily pushed through the people, her young voice trembling, You lied to my mother. The hall of silence that followed cut deeper than any accusation. James' jaw clenched, sweat dripping, his mask gone. He snarled, You think truth matters. All that matters is control. The words froze the crowd in stunned horror. The justice figure, Investigator Harris, stepped forward, his badge glinting under the fading sun. He declared, James Whitmore, you are under investigation for fraud and theft. The crowd erupted, half in rage, half in relief. James' eyes darted, searching for an escape, but there was none. Margaret whispered, almost to herself, The mask is gone. James spat, You'll regret crossing me. His voice cracked, no longer the silk-tongued heir, but a cornered predator. Harris's voice was steady, No, James, it's over. Margaret's trembling eased, replaced with grim resolve. For the first time, the balance of power shifted visibly. As Harris moved closer, Linda emerged from the side of the crowd, her voice breaking, James, tell them the truth. The people gasped, eyes whipping toward her. Margaret froze, betrayal searing her again. James sneered, Don't play Saint, Linda, you were part of this. The crowd shouted in fury, betrayal deepening into chaos. Linda's face crumpled, tears spilling as she confessed, I thought I'd share in the reward, but he used me too. Margaret's voice thundered, We all bled for his lies. The town, united by rage and revelation, pressed forward, their fury no longer containable. The moment snapped into violence. Townsfolk surged forward, shouting, their anger boiling over. Harris raised his hands, shouting, Stay back, let justice take him alive. But James lunged toward Margaret, snarling, You ruined everything. Margaret stood firm, her eyes blazing as she shouted, No, James! You destroyed yourself. The crowd roared, the air trembling with the weight of truth colliding with vengeance. James faltered, his polished mask shattered forever. Margaret's tears mixed with rain as she whispered, It ends tonight. The climax burned with rage, grief, and justice, colliding in one unbearable instant. The square was silent, except for the drip of rainwater from eaves. James, shackled, was led away by Investigator Harris. The once proud conman kept his head high, but his eyes betrayed panic. Margaret stood in the crowd, her breath unsteady, whispering, It's over. Yet the words felt hollow, for no justice could return the years of hope stolen. Robert stepped closer, his hand firm on her shoulder, murmuring, "He can't hurt us anymore." But Margaret's eyes stayed fixed on James as he disappeared into the night. She muttered, "The damage is done." The crowd dispersed slowly, carrying shame and anger that would never fully heal. The next morning Margaret sat at her kitchen table, sunlight spilling across unpaid bills and the unopened college letter. She whispered, "Nothing's changed." Emily entered quietly, asking, "Are we still broken?" Margaret smiled faintly, brushing her daughter's cheek, whispering, "We're bruised but not broken." Emily's voice trembled. "I believed him too." Tears burned Margaret's eyes, but she replied, "Belief isn't weakness. It's what makes us human." She held her daughter tightly, the two clinging like survivors in a storm. For the first time, Margaret felt not hope, but a fierce determination to move forward without illusions. At the diner, Sarah poured Margaret a cup of coffee without a word. The clink of porcelain filled the silence. Finally, Sarah said softly, "I'm sorry for being harsh. I just wanted you safe." Margaret sighed, her voice low. "You were right all along. I didn't want to hear it." Sarah's eyes softened, guilt mixing with relief. She replied, "You're stronger than you think. Stronger than him." Margaret smiled faintly, though her eyes still carried shadows. The diner felt emptier, the laughter of the past replaced with heavy quiet. Yet in the silence, something steady began to grow, trust rebuilt from ashes. Linda stood alone outside the courthouse, head bowed, face streaked with tears. The townsfolk passed her with glares and whispers, their contempt sharp as knives. She muttered, "I thought I mattered." Her voice vanished into the cold air. Margaret approached slowly, her heart torn between anger and pity. She said, "You chose his lies over our lives." Linda's shoulders sagged, whispering, "I was blind." Margaret's eyes narrowed, her voice firm. "Blindness doesn't excuse betrayal." For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy with finality. Margaret walked away, leaving Linda crumbling under the weight of her choices. Now, that evening, Margaret walked through the quiet cemetery, pausing at her husband's grave. She knelt, brushing raindrops from the stone, whispering, "I nearly lost myself." The silence around her was deep, broken only by rustling leaves. She added, "But I'm still here, and she's still safe." Tears fell freely, washing away the last of her illusions. The air was heavy, but her heart steadier than it had been in years. She whispered one final vow, "No one will use us again." Rising slowly, she left the grave with her shoulders straight, carrying not hope, but hard-earned strength. James sat alone in a dim holding cell, the clang of the iron door echoing into silence. His hair was damp, his suit torn, but his eyes still glittered with defiance. He whispered to himself, "They think they've beaten me." A smirk crept across his lips, sharp and unbroken. He leaned back, chains clinking, and said softly, "A man like me never loses. I just wait." The shadows stretched long across the concrete, swallowing his face. For the first time he looked less like a prisoner, and more like a predator biding time. The air chilled, as if the walls themselves feared him. Margaret walked down the main street at dawn, the town hushed in uneasy calm. Windows were shuttered, storefronts quiet, hope still fragile. She whispered, "We'll rebuild, but it won't be the same." Emily slipped her hand into hers, eyes heavy with questions she didn't voice. Margaret forced a small smile, whispering, "We're free now." But in her heart, freedom felt hollow, the scars etched too deep to fade. The air smelled of rain and ash, carrying the weight of what had been lost. Every step forward was both a victory and a wound that would never fully close. At the diner, Sarah wiped down tables in silence, the clink of cups echoing like ghosts. She looked up at Margaret and said quietly, "He'll haunt this town for years." Margaret nodded, her voice calm. "We'll carry him like a scar, but scars remind us to fight harder." Sarah sighed. "People like him always come back one way or another." Margaret's gaze hardened, whispering, "Then we'll be ready next time." The quiet between them was heavy, not hopeless but sharpened by resolve. Yet even in resolve, fear lingered like a shadow that would never fully lift. Robert stood outside the courthouse, speaking to a small cluster of townsfolk. His voice was heavy. We were blinded by promises, but truth has cost us dearly. Faces around him sagged, guilt etched in their lines. He added, we must never let one man own our trust again. The words rang like a vow, but the silence that followed was louder. Margaret watched from a distance, her expression unreadable. She knew the scars weren't just his to bear but hers as well. The crowd nodded slowly, though their eyes revealed doubt. Trust, once broken, was not easily rebuilt. Late at night, Margaret sat alone by her husband's grave, the cemetery silent under silver moonlight. She whispered, "It's finished, but not forgotten." A chill wind carried her words into the dark. She closed her eyes, hearing James' voice echo in memory, "A man like me never loses." Her eyes snapped open, fear rippling with determination. She whispered fiercely, "You won't win again." The camera of fate pulled back, leaving her alone in the graveyard, a solitary figure between love lost and shadows yet to come. The final blow struck not with violence but with dread. The story was closed, but the echo lingered forever.